Dublin before World War II.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for being here. I'm delighted to be here. It's fun to have a group of people that are interested in one's work. So I'm very happy to be here with you. You are going to be seeing two parts of a very, very large piece of work, which is this, basically, in summary. It was composed as a traveling library kind of set of materials for teachers and students. So what you have is just the middle book, this part, that's what you have, a version of it, and the website, which is another part to all of this. The website is not here, it's a separate part also. And so by looking at individual parts without looking at the totality and not working with all of this the way it was designed conceptually, so you're always seeing parts of what was meant to be. Hopefully the parts do something also, because there is no other design of how to see the whole thing. This has not been published and it's not sold and so on and so forth. I want to speak to you on 4 areas. First of all, why we did this. You know, what was the motivation to do this? What were we searching? What did I want to achieve? And second, why Jewish culture needed such a thing, I felt. Then I will describe a little bit more about the product itself, all these parts that are here. And then I'll go to the website, which is the part that you have been now being familiarized with, and just browse a little bit in it. So the first problem is why? What is this for, in a general sense? Why was this important? And it seems to me that as a sociologist, one looks at history or social studies of any culture, any society, whether it's Mexico, where I come from, whether it's the United States, or Europe, where Jews lived for 1,000 years. And you see that the narratives that the society gives you about whatever it was going on, how they explain themselves, their own history, always do very, very little for minorities. They don't treat them. So they mention them. Indigenous people in Mexico are mentioned, of course, when the Spanish came and the conquest, they're there. Jews in Eastern Europe, yes, they were a minority, people know about it. But when you come to a crisis moment, like the Holocaust, like the Second World War, and you have to explain what happened in that war, and you have to say, how is it that these people were murdered? It's very difficult for a student, a young person, to come to history like that and understand what they're talking about when you use the narrative that is normally given. The narrative that is normally given comes to the crisis, says, yes, this is an event that happened, 6 million people were murdered, it was bad, it was ugly, it was not nice, it was terrible, it was this, it was that, these are the culpable people, those are the ones that suffered more, whatever. That's it. How did you explain such a thing in the 20th century? What does that mean? That in Europe, in the western part of the world that is so sophisticated, so advanced, and so on and so forth, some event like that happened that opened the door, that started a style, if you want, of genocidal killings all over the world later on, into other groups, in smaller groups, different groups, and so on and so forth. It was the first event, unique on its own way, but not the only one. Okay? So how do you explain that? It's very, very hard to explain it with the way we are taught today, our students. And so my motivation was to, number one, change that narrative. Include into the mainstream narrative of a history of a people or a region, minorities. They have to be part of what we're talking about, and they have to be understood as an integral component of that history. Having said that, then this was the problem. Of course, then I go to internal problems. Why haven't Jews done this sort of thing? Do they teach it like that better in Jewish schools or in Israel and so on and so forth? And we have problems on that department also. After the trauma of the Second World War, there was a formation of 2 main groups. Jews traveled to wherever they could find a home, safe place, right? South Africa, Latin America, Argentina, Mexico, and so on and so forth. But the larger 2 communities that formed of survival Jews were in the United States and Israel. And those people were occupied with other issues of their own time. While there were some that dedicated themselves to write their memories and write year-score books, write up anything they could about what happened to their communities and their lives, and we have more or around 1,000 books of that sort talking about communal life and who they were and what was destroyed. They did not become part of the general narrative of Jews themselves. Jews were healing themselves in different ways, whether it was economic or politically, or we're not dealing with that right now, it's a topic on its own, and actually did not understand that the part of that healing needed to be to reconstruct their own culture. That's what we're fighting for, isn't it? Survival of culture, languages, whatever was destroyed and attacked during the war, to be taken back again and put into the mainstream again. And that wasn't done by Jews either. So here we have an effort, our modest effort, to try to create a curriculum to integrate it either into Jewish schools or general schools through history or social studies, right? And to do that, when you don't have good information on the historical background of a society, what do people know about Eastern Europe? How do you approach when you come to, you must remember your history courses in high school, for instance, when you deal with Europe, the Second World War. It's snapshots. It's snapshots of information. There's no narrative. There's no explanatory good information. If you have sensitivities towards minorities, and you probably do because that's why you're here, any type of minorities, and cultural minorities, linguistic minorities especially so maybe that sort of prompts you to ask questions and to search for answers, but it's not easily available out there. So that we started then thinking, how do we do that? First of all, we had to justify the project. And the justification came from the point of view, not only academically, but philosophically. You know, the justification is that we need to understand the other, and we need to care for the other. Every group cares more or less, not always perfectly, for themselves. But if we don't care for the other, and we always become another. Today I am myself, but tomorrow I am another to somebody else. Right? If we are not aware that we need to care for the other, meaning their culture, their way of life, their language, we are not safeguarding the survival of humanity. That's as simple as that in a one sentence. So the whole project has politically, ethically, and philosophical grounds that are very, very important. You know? And that's the message. Through all of it, at the end, that is the message. We chose, how do you do that? How do you describe a culture? How do you describe what was lost? How do you describe a language? What the language does for you? It's extraordinarily difficult. And I wanted to do something like that, that a high school student could have seeds of the importance of these issues, and then later on a university student could get back to it, you know, and study it in depth in a more profound way. But how do I convey that? It was an enormous task that took a long, long time to try to sort out. I don't know whether I was successful or not, but anyway, the result of the attempt was, number one, to create this set of things. How did we do it? I had an essay, and this was written with Monica Adamczyk, the professor that you saw that interview. She, with her husband, who is a historian, and she's Polish, of course, and I wanted her to give me a small essay of the narrative of the Polish history, their perspective, you know, and the minorities living in their midst, in a small essay for a teacher, so that a teacher coming to this subject that doesn't know enough should get something already themselves. The second essay we prepared was a description of European Jewry, which is also very difficult because you have regional differences, you have linguistic differences, you have 1,000-year culture. You know, how do you synthesize that in an essay? Professor Kassau, Sam Kassau, did this essay for us, and I hear that he may be publishing that book separately, independently right now in the future, very near future. So that was an essay that he started writing and describing culturally the group, the distinctiveness of Ashkenazi Jewry, and what is it that they produced in their life that gave them tools to understand their world and live with it for 1,000 years. And then it came my job to write actually myself, not just conceive of all of this, but to write something, and I didn't know where to go. I wanted to describe 5 main cities, because each city in Eastern Europe had a different style, like every place in the world. Just think of New York and Los Angeles and London or something like that. They are all different. You don't live in the same way in each one of these places. The same happened then. Even if you're Jewish and if you share that culture, you live differently. You have different things in each place. But it became an enormous task. And so in choosing which one I should go and how should I start, I decided to go to Lublin, who is a city, who was a city, a middle-range city. Maybe at the time that I started, it was a royal city, a very important city. But what Lublin gave me was that my narrative of history didn't start in the 19th century or 20th century or something like that. I could go back to the 15th century with it, and earlier, the settlement is from the 13th century. And by the time I have the 15th century, I'm talking about an extraordinarily sophisticated center for Jewish life. And that's at the high. I'm starting my narrative with a wonderful, sophisticated development already of people that at that time had already a network of organizations, a network of institutions that lived a very complex life. And I'm starting to, like a flower, to peel off from there, you know, what institutions, how they lived and so on. So my narrative in describing Lublin like that, long term, is to try to sort of familiarize the reader with institutions, with way of thinking, with social ways of living and so on and so forth, till you come to the interwar period, which is of course the most familiar to us and the most sophisticated in a way. But you have already a language of their own. You have to explain how it is that they didn't assimilate to other languages, to the local languages. You have to explain why people like that, which were a minority, a cultural minority, but maybe a numerical majority in maybe many areas, but still a minority as far as the dominant culture was concerned. And that's important. There is a big difference. The context was enormously large, yet they move, they connect, they live between Poland and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Just think about how many languages they pass by, from the German area to northern France, to Hungarian, Czech, Lithuanian, Estonian, and Russian, and so on and so forth, Slavic languages. All of that is there, and people normally adopt and adapt the local language to live best. And these people had a way of sustaining their own language. And in those 800 years, if you want, converted that language in an extraordinary sophisticated tool that got a Nobel Prize in the 20th century, you know, with its literature. So you can imagine that is a question to be asked, because all immigrants today, most of them, the second generation drops most of what they have, or tries to adapt as quick as they can to wherever they live. And here there was a system that worked with sustaining culture and as well as adapting, because they were perfectly functional. But what was it and how they related between all the other minorities as well as the majority culture that lived and led to the trauma and the drama of the 20th century and the Holocaust, it's something that needs to be understood. I'm not saying that we have the last word on that explanation. There's thousands of books trying to explain that. But we need to understand that the question deserves asking, because we are not talking about a volcano that suddenly erupted and we can't explain and there was trauma. No, that's not what happened. Something else happened. These people lived together, exchanged together, cooperated, fought, analyzed, shared, and so on and so forth. How is it that university intellectuals, like somebody called Heidegger, how other great professors in their societies didn't feel that they were doing harm in accepting the totalitarianism that was ready to kill, millions of people? So, questions that need to be addressed and asked. once we have the Lublin, you get a book, but you get really a poor version of what is going on, because the way I decided to work it is that the footnotes that a normal book has came in two different books, and this is the footnotes. You can imagine how this would have looked if it was published in one. But you don't get that, because we don't have this kind of publication. The idea was that the teacher doesn't have time to do the kind of research that we did, right? Nor does the student. So that the student reads the basic material, but here there is a map that you couldn't find immediately. There is an explanation of a document that explains a footnote. There is photographs. There are and all sorts of things that come together so that in the hands of the teacher, the teacher can select that part, whatever is necessary for them to present to the student and go more in depth once they need it. So we have source material as well as reading material to go in depth on certain topics. It's a very, very large undertaking to present it this way. And then what we did is that we created two curriculums. One which I called advanced and the other one basic. The advanced is probably for college students and the basic one is for high school students. And that meant to take every topic, and I'll give an example right now of one, and sort of unpack it and make it contemporary and relevant for today. For instance, we're talking about Jews as a minority living in a city. The way that settlement started with a rule that the Jews cannot live within the city. They have to live in the outskirts of the city. And I invented a term for that rule, a parapolis. They created a city outside of the city. That's not very obvious. That's a strange kind of accepting rule. Why can't these people, if they are invited to come and settle, to participate in the economy and so on and so forth, why can't they live within the city? Even if it's a special neighborhood, if they want to live together, why not? They like to share their language, their culture, let them live together. But why outside? Why kept one step away from us? The us and the you were already established way, way back in the 13th century. Okay? And that changed. Somebody brought themselves into it. The rules were circumvented. It wasn't as clear as it appeared to be. Things didn't happen exactly as they were described on paper. All of that is true. But the basic principles of how to treat the other were established on documents, even if in practical terms things work differently. To analyze that, it's interesting to think of today of immigrant neighborhoods. Where are they allowed to live? How are they given access to a new society when they come to? Are they given access? Aren't they given access? Do they get a passport? Can they apply for one? You know, all of these rules are today exactly the same. You know, do we let them in? How many do we let in? Why do we let in people? Do we feel responsible for these other people? When do we need to feel responsible for them? All sorts of questions are developed here as topics of analysis to be able to be able to deal with the students. Just let me see if I can find. Who writes these constitutions? Why are we comfortable with these constitutions? When can we change any rule like that? Why are privileges given to certain people and not to others? How do we decide? All of those questions are relevant questions of today, and they're questions of then. So, in other words, by making this material relevant for the culture, for the minority, for whatever the minority stands for, I also was trying to make it relevant to today. And why is it important? All the time. Anyway, I don't know if you see or feel that when you read the book alone, but this is the attempt of this whole package. And then finally, we created a website which was completely new materials, synthetic materials of many, many subjects, where a student, we thought today, that likes easy access and visual, very much visual access to things, should be able to get something from the way the people looked, how they dressed, who they were, the social classes that they had. They should be able to hear a little bit of the language, and I haven't talked about that too much. In the package there is a CD originally with poetry, with songs, with stuff, because I wanted the new student to hear the language. Even within the Jewish people, in the Jewish community, there is such a disconnect already with Yiddish that some people can ask you, is it French? What exactly are you talking? You know, when they hear you speaking, there is no recognition that you recognize Italian, and do you all speak Italian? You recognize French, you know, and you don't speak necessarily French or German, and yet this other language is a total non-entity for many, many people, even within the group. And that should be a shocker, you know, an enormous shocker. So we wanted to have sound there. There is access to sound, there is access to some history, and there is the idea that we wanted to present as much as one can the way of life in places whether Jews lived in big cities, in smaller towns, which was the majority, lived in towns which are called in Yiddish shtetl, and that has become a concept almost for some mythological and nostalgic, as if the majority of Jews lived in a shtetl, and they were shtetl Jews, but it is a word for something. It's an urban place, small place that had often a market day or days, so that it was an area where it converged from different smaller hinterland cities or towns or places people came to sell their wares, and there was a way of life like that. By the 19th, 20th century, we have schools, we have tremendous amount of organizations and political organizations. Jews in the interwar period were asking those fundamental questions that minorities are asking today. Where do we live? Can we settle? Do we belong in this society? Some people said yes. Some people said no. Look, we don't belong. We need to leave. We need to find our other home. Zionists went for that answer, because they didn't feel that it was working out. But other people, like Bundis or Folkists, were saying, no, we do belong. We've been here for 1,000 years. We must belong. They must understand that we belong. And so people were working out these answers. Others were saying, you know what, we don't belong anywhere. Let's immigrate to America and drop it all. You know, you had assimilationists. You had all sorts of answers. The questions were there. And the answers were attempted to be given by many political positions that Jews represented at the time. It was a very effervescent period, very, very rich, and you, people like you, at your age, were involved in making choices for themselves and others. And when we come to the war, that was something very important to me, that I didn't want to talk about the war as the general books of history were doing, describing either the military parts of it or the political issues. I wanted to describe, if possible, in a simple essay, what befell on the shoulders of young people once the elders, when I say elders, the 50-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and often 30-year-old leaders of the Jewish community and life were killed off immediately. And so what is this youth needed to do to decide to sustain some sort of life? And so because the war took so long, it's not a few months, we need to understand what structures the Jews create then to survive, to make them survive. So that's a whole different chapter. What else? We have lives, try to show social classes and activities and work and culture. Of course, we talk a little bit about, smattering of all of these things in the website. And it basically should work like a good set of sweets, to make you addictive to the sugar. And after you have something of that, you should really go and delve into books and the appropriate way to learn because that's just the beginning. But there are many ways of working with that, depending on high school or college, early admission to the subject, and you can sort of work and enrich yourself. There is quite a lot of material to start going and start thinking about. So that's basically, I've talked about the general objectives, the program itself, a little bit about the website. I mentioned to you the CD. I want to show you a little bit about the website. You started with it, looking at it or not? Yes? So let's see if you go to And also I want to say that once I went to Lublin, you know, besides having Monica and the Bramagrodzka people, and I don't know if it's this is seeing me, but I want to say that on tape, there is an extraordinary group of people that I hadn't met before. And a group of people that from that community and that world, which were not Jewish, that were missing and understanding what a vacuum was left in their culture, were struggling with these issues themselves. And I found young people doing that sort of work. It took me totally by surprise, completely by surprise. Those philosophical questions, I'm not talking about somebody studying a particular subject as an academic takes to any topic. I'm talking about delving into what is behind all of this. And that made me have an enormous amount of respect, and I was super happy that I hit upon Lublin in an area which was doing fantastic work towards Jewry, Jewish culture, and the Jewish language. And I feel that we had made that, in a way, this is a contribution to them just as well also. So this cooperation that you hear now Professor Bell's doing with them is really the result of a very interesting set of circumstances, that linkages, if you want, that have given a group of people there interested in this, and us here, you know, wherever we are interested in Jewish culture and working for Jewry and for the maintenance and continuity of not losing what was lost. We need a new generation to know what was there for 1,000 years. We can't just let it go. And we can't let it go as a history, we can't let it go as a culture, we can't let go of that language. And the language is the key to be able to study those things. Because without the key, you can't access the documentation in the original language of 1,000 years. And therefore, the language is important. Okay, having said that, let's go to this. And then, of course, you can interrupt either before we get to it or afterwards if you have questions or comments.
You have to turn the display on.
Yeah, I did.
No, it's on.
Okay, it's coming.
Sure.
The 10-second delay.
Yeah.
All right.
Good.
So you see in the right side corner, we symbolically use the two Jewish languages to name the program. In Yiddish, the top, der Erziehungsprogramm wegen Yiddischer Kultur, which is the description of the title in Yiddish, and then underneath it in Hebrew, the second and other Jewish language, the national language of Israel, of course, Tochnit Chinuchit Lelimut Tarbut Yehudit. It's the same thing said in Hebrew. And of course you have it in English. So, and we divided it in these three large categories. You see them: lives, places, culture. But we have other things that help the movement of the website. We have information for teachers and how to do and create three tours. I gave an example of 3 tours, meaning connect this, and you have a topic. Connect this, and this, and you have another topic, and so on and so forth. Guided tours are that. The timeline is a timeline that a historical professor created for us, using major events that are important in the Eastern European history, as well as general history, more or less, and maps, which are lovely, very, very good maps, actually. I'm going to start there, show them a little bit. Look at those maps from 11th century migrations. You know that Poland, it was an empire, an enormous empire with Lithuania for a time, but during in the 1700s started to be eaten up by other smaller empires that were becoming stronger, their economy weaker, so they were losing. That's what is called the partitions. See, the 3 different colors are areas that were taken away by different empires until there was no Poland anymore. Okay, till after the First World War. Anyway, you have those kinds of maps. You have credits is not important. Let's go to lives a little bit. And so you hear voices, because we have youngsters that have written and left material, written up in a contest. You probably read about it. There was a contest in the Ivo Institute that wanted to have more grassroots information of lifestyles. Anyway, there are lots of problems with the contest itself because you never know if somebody writes the real thing or embellishes to win or whatever. But it is what it is. They are original materials, and they are there. And we selected a few. We have portraits, and you see faces, you see children, girls, different ones, poor and better off, and dolls, and a more bourgeois little child, and so on, or boys. Smoking hasn't changed, and a more religious little child with the hair locks, or couples which. Anyway.
You can access the couples from the middle.
Yeah, from the middle of the menu.
From which middle?
Click on it again, and then in the middle of that page it says couples and families.
Thank you. See, it shows that I haven't been playing with this for a while. Okay, so you see couples, different interesting couples, yeah? And you feel that it's not so far away, grandparents look like that, and so on. Okay, let's take you to places, and I'm going to go to the cities, and you have different important cities. They're not the only cities that are important, but the most important cities of Eastern Europe at the time. I'm going to Lublin, and Lublin is a fascinating place, actually, because it has an old town, which is gorgeous and small. It's like a jewel. You can walk it, old medieval kind of period. The castle is still there. It hasn't all been destroyed. Much of it has, but not all. And so it's really, you can sort of, if you have the writer's imagination or the poetic imagination, you can walk around there feeling that you're walking the stones of a very, very old people and culture, and it's a fascinating area. Well, outside of the old city, there is an important city called street called Lubartowska. And Lubartowska exists today. It's a curved kind of city that takes you from the entrance to the old town to the end there where the yeshiva is, the big old institution of higher learning for Jews is. And before I show you a little bit about it, I want to talk about it, how it happened that we managed to do this, because it was an interesting thing. We had been given from the archives, we had photographs that a person was taking off the street for the government at the time, because they were collecting taxes, and they went for the records. They needed photographs of every storefront or something like that, and so there were scattered photographs that we were given by this photographer, which we were looking at, and for somebody that is doing this kind of work, these visuals are lovely. I was reading a separate book at the time, working on a book of a survivor that was a Lublin woman that was living in Switzerland, and she wrote a book, and she was describing. It so happens that she lived in Lubartowska, she was describing the building where she lived and her neighbors, and she was a little girl, and this woman was a seamstress, and her mother used to go across the apartment to that woman, and above she used to go and bake with the woman and get from her sugar and a couple of eggs, and the other one was not a nice person, because she was always, screaming to her husband, and I don't know what else, and the children, and how the building functioned, and that there was not the bathrooms were outside the building. I mean, suddenly I'm reading this, and I'm thinking it's like a film. To my mind, it's a film. I'm seeing how an inside building was functioning, the neighbors, how she got her new dress, how she went to school, how the parents had to go to ask for a day off from school so that they can go and pay off the rent because they were late. And stories like that, not totally connected. It wasn't a novel. It was just stories of these neighborhoods, and how her school was in number 19, and how she lived in 21, and how her best friend lived in some other number, and I don't know what. And to remember all of this, because I didn't know what to do with that information. How do I use it, right? How do I do something with that? I was completely taken by it. I'm a daughter of an architect. So I took a piece of paper and I made drawings for myself, a street, and I put buildings. And wherever she described a building of 5 floors, I put a building with 5 floors, and I gave it the number. And I did my own kind of summary of what she was saying in an architectural design. And I left it on my desk, and and my assistant, Michael Cohen, at the time, came in to leave stuff and saw what I left. I mean, I was working on it on my desk. And he said, I don't know, something happened to his thinking because he was working on the pictures. And he said, oh, number 21, I think I saw a number 21 on one of those pictures. And 19, I saw a number 19. Anyway, next day I come back, or 2 days later, and he prepared for me the photographs in a sequence as if reconstructing the street, which we didn't know that we could do at all. We didn't even have the faintest idea that we had the material to do that. So even though it sounds like a very easy stuff, it was a whole story behind it, which is worth it, to remember. For us, it was like a miracle that we could reconstruct a whole street. And so we decided to include it in the website. And the way we like to do it is that we describe the street and we try. Technology is another problem, right? So we have the view of the street as you see it above. And what we are looking at right now is that yellow box only. And as you move that, you see the whole street. And of course, you can stop wherever you want and enlarge it a little bit, look more. And we have translated some of what the storefronts mean from Polish to English. So here was sold underwear, pajamas, and lingerie, and this is fruit, and here we have hardware store, and so on and so forth. So you get the information from reading whatever it is that is happening. You get a little bit of this passage, and you're walking around this wonderful street. Now, let me tell you, those buildings are there today. Exactly. The only thing that has changed is the storefronts. Now today there are windows like that, like what you have in this room, much more light and so on and so forth. And the attire of the people is not the same, of course, and you don't see a horse buggy there either. But other than that, the place is there, and you probably can walk up one of these buildings and get the sense of how those apartments were, although I'm sure much of it has been renovated internally by the tenant. So, in any case, all of this was a way to try to contribute to building up an atmosphere of the sense of that you've been there, that you sense a life that was moving as a movie, actually, not just as snapshots of history and of life. Yes, open up the floor to comments.
So let's have comments on all levels. First, the beginning part. It doesn't have to go in any order, but just to remember Dr. Cimet's presentation about the reason for doing it, the whole plan of doing this. Then also like your essays, your reaction to working with the website, and then any kind of
criticism, because
questions,
it's one thing that I wanted.
I asked you to write criticism, and then any questions that have come up, and then tying any of this to other things that we've done. So wherever you want to start, you don't have to start in any order, but that's all of you have thought about it because you did the assignment. So please.
Well, I guess I'll break this into two
Tell them your
parts.
name, because in Lublin they want to identify you.
Hi, I'm Karina. I'm going to break this into two parts since you did the explanation in the beginning. So I wanted to make a comment on, I started reading the book, and I found that when I was reading it, I thought it was very easy to read. And I was surprised because I was thinking, a textbook on Lublin, it must be more of a college sense, like very in-depth. And I was reading through it pretty quickly, and I was wondering who the audience was. And now I see that you were aiming for just like regular education or high school students, and I like how it went. That's like my comment on that, I guess. And secondly, for the website, I don't know how much work you put into it personally, or how much the web designer did it, but my question is, why there are so many pop-ups instead of using that blank space on the side? Because I thought it was a very awkward layout, and so many pop-ups came up, and I was like, but I want to look at this, and it was just kind of confusing for me.
Okay, so let's go to the first part. The first part is about the book. The book was designed to be an easy read in any situation, not a heavy-duty academic thing. Whether a young person, whether an older person, whether a tourist reading, anybody can read through it and go through it, and that's it. So yes, if that happens, then that was meant to be like that. And it wasn't meant to live at that level only, obviously, from what I'm showing you. but it was meant to be in just something that anybody can read in a couple of days and go through and just stimulate your thinking. Not to lower the level at all, but actually to make it accessible to anyone on an easy path. Now, I never imagined at the time that the book was going to be read alone, as a standalone, sold alone, and so on. The idea was that it was going to be part of schools, and in the beginning, that's the way that started to be worked. We had a seminar with 18 schools that took on the work of working the material through their courses with the whole system. They came to a seminar, we taught them how I wanted them to work, and so on. The teachers came. So that happened, but as all stories go, in that department, the money dried out, and we couldn't continue with that system being done. So the books never got published outside to be sold as a package. We had it given to them in that box like that as a traveling library, actually. So every teacher used to get such a box with everything. So that's
Adina,
that.
could
Yes.
we just say that I believe everything is downloadable?
That correct.
Which
But
means that there's access to all
correct
books.
to everything.
know if you tasted it.
For teachers,
Right.
you have every single book downloadable.
Right.
But for a time, it wasn't working well. I'm not
Right.
sure if it's working well. And the problem with that, I mean, I accepted that, of course, at the time, because why not? It
Right.
makes it's accessible to anyone. But I felt that to download a book like this,
Yeah.
it's complicated. You know, you have to download just a section or a particular part that you need, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I mean, I really don't know how easy
Right.
that concept is, but it exists. And certainly, if you have an interest on a particular thing,
Right.
you can get to it.
So I thought for this group, for example, which has more of an introduction than almost anyone to the project when you finish this course,
Yeah.
in the future, if you ever wanted to do a project, research project paper on a specific topic related, it is accessible. You don't have to do the research on your own. You have the sources. You know, this would be an easy project, and your professor wouldn't even understand. I mean, you would reference it, but they wouldn't understand how much work was put into it. So you can really access it, which is nice. It's not
Right.
accessible.
The second book, the reader, is all original sources are there. Brought directly to the reader, to the teacher, so they don't have to look for it. We looked for days, for months. We had to get permits to get it. It's there. Now, your other question was why exactly the design? That is true. We hired the company at the time. We had a budget on how to do this. This is already 10 years or so. I don't know. I knew very little about it. I am my age, and we just went with a company that wanted to respect the budget that we had for it. And we had a person that was our liaison from our team with them. And the discussions were from the color scheme to the boxes, to the movement. There was just so much we could do. And when we found something that we as users weren't happy with, sometimes it was impossible to change because it cost too much money to do a modification, or we were over our budget and so on. I'm not saying that particular problem was necessarily something that we felt. Sometimes we wanted static images that they gave us not to be static because we felt that the website was becoming too dated. And the truth is that you can work with such a tool, and if there is money and resources, you can update it, you can change it, you can expand it, you can do lots of things, and it was created with that capability, but the money isn't there. So it's stuck to the level that we left it, and I'm sure there are quite a few other things that not always work out perfectly. Yes?
I just had two content-related questions, more about the content of the course. When you mentioned earlier that this idea that genocide, the Holocaust especially, presents this total affront to understanding, and then you talked about the idea of the other. Do you think that the way we treat immigrant groups is what perpetuates the practice of genocide? And that we are not welcoming, or we continually peripheralize these groups, and that contributes to the fact that we can't seem to stop committing the act of genocide, even though we're always never forget, never again.
I think that whatever happened then hasn't been exorcised from our political systems, hasn't been sufficiently addressed as the negativity it is. And the war happened, there was some reparations, there were some, trials, there are some history books. We have to move on and we have to live. We have a philosophy of, try to forget or settle or accommodate yourself. If you walk around talking about it the whole day, you're obsessed, you are impossible, you are this, you are that. It's difficult. It's very difficult. And that goes for the individual level. My mother is a survivor. She was a child in Kovno, in Kaunas, from Lithuania. And she was 9 years old when we started. She was 15 when we finished, no, 14. And she said that when they came to relatives or to people, and they were eager to talk, they were eager to tell, and they were crying. And everybody immediately said, no, don't upset yourself and don't upset me. And let's move on and let's have a, Coca-Cola and a piece of cake. And, maybe it's easier, but you don't get anywhere with doing that. And people did that at the level of individual lives and at the level of political states and so on and so forth. In my opinion, humble opinion, this hasn't been exercised enough anywhere, politically and anywhere. Not in Europe, and not in America, and not anywhere. The fact of the matter that you have people today saying they don't even know the Holocaust, they don't know what happened, they don't even know where, they don't believe, that I have to come and say, you don't trust the history that happened, I have to justify? It's absurd. So the whole questioning of how does a totalitarian system come to exist even? How do we allow such a political structure to dominate the thinking of a special group and imposing? That hasn't been addressed sufficiently, We have people with that kind of rhetoric and narratives going around, and people seem to say you have the right to speak it. And maybe you do have rights, but there are rights of rights, and everybody has a right. And we haven't sort of rooted that principle enough in the world. Is that the reason why we see it happening? That's a big generalization, of course. Places have their own history and their own conflicts, but we have many systems of thinking, whether it is religions, whether it's politics, whether it's cultural, and whether it's thugs, that walk around, that seem to be able to construct a narrative that justifies attacks on others that are acceptable. And that seem to be acceptable. And we have to be very, very careful. It's not in one area only. It's in many, many sides of our world, of our world.
And I suppose my second question was, when you discussed the fact that the people of Lublin seem to have this heightened cultural awareness and that they recognize very strongly that they're missing a group that they're not a part of. How do you think that kind of awareness can be transmitted to other parts of the world in which there are other groups that are just completely eradicated from social climate, and these groups don't seem to have the same, I don't think the same process is occurring in Bosnia or in Rwanda. Do you think it's just the type of access to education people in Lublin have, or is it a...
Well, when I say that there are people in Lublin that I feel that way, that it's not all the people of Lublin, not the whole of Lublin. It's the group of this institution that has gotten support, and a couple of people that are very stubborn, that started a couple of years with this work, and that made it happen. And eventually they have educated a whole cadre of people that are following and working with them. And today it's an institution. When I came, Ramagrovska was tiny, 7 people or so. Today they are a big place. So why? I don't know. Why? Maybe there are some visionary people, some emotionally and sophisticated thinkers that devote themselves to do something in their life, and they achieve it, and they're successful. How much change in their own society they have achieved is also to be seen. They are not as strong as other institutes. They are a regional place in Poland also. Not everybody is happy with their work, and not always they get the support that they need to. When I was there introducing the book, I think, We were met by the mayor, and we were given a lot of official, like Lublin is on the map for the world, and we've done a service, and on the other side, for tourism, all sorts of things. But I'm not sure, and I haven't followed up. Maybe people listening can give a better answer. But I'm not sure how extraordinary the support of the political structure there has been towards the institutions, so that they further their work. So I don't know. Now, other societies have opted for other mechanisms on how to deal with their problems. They are restitution forms. They are truth commissions. They are. And all have something positive maybe to give, and all fail in other capacities also. So it also depends on how, and you have to have the partners that are in dialogue or not in dialogue, how they're going to do this.
Right.
It's not easy.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Yes.
Any other comments? I don't know if I should mention this, and it's just my little personal analysis just about the Lublin case study. I think I mentioned it to the students. I put this together myself, just based on a little bit of information that I got. If you saw our film, Toby Sunshine, it was dedicated to Lucian Dobrzycki. He was a historian, a child survivor. His whole family was eradicated, and he grew up in post-World War II Poland, and with an adoptive family. These children who were left alone had adoptive families. He became a historian. He decided to study the Holocaust. And he taught me and some other people, I'm not a historian, certain things. And then he introduced us to the story of one of his friends. One of his friends was Władysław Bartoszewski, very well-known historian in Poland, no longer alive. Bartoszewski was the co-head of an organization in the Warsaw Ghetto on the Aryan side to save Jews during the war, young man. He becomes a historian after the war. And I don't know much about him. I met his son. I met him, I believe. He gets a professorship in Lublin at the university. I'm getting at the theme of mentorship. He finds two people. One of them is Monika Adamczyk. The other one is a student, her husband, I don't know his first name, Chris Garbowska. He introduces them. They get married. Monika Adamczyk studies English literature, and she decides to specialize in Isaac Bashevis Singer, who's a Yiddish writer but translated extensively. She becomes an expert on Yiddish, in the Yiddish language too. He becomes a historian. Monika Adamczyk Garbowska founds the Center for Jewish Studies at the Maria Curie Skłodowsky University. So she then influences, other people. Bartoszewski is a supporter, if you know the politics of Lech Walesa, the workers that organize, anti-communist, a little liberal center. Lublin is a little liberal center in communist, totalitarian Poland under the influence of the Soviet Union. So all of these are influences. Lech Walesa wins, right? The Soviet Union falls. There's a new Poland in the period you're studying the novel. The first foreign minister of Lech Walesa's government is Władysław Bartoszewski. Monika Adamczyk, because of the work that she does, I was told by one of her colleagues, is on a hit list of anti-Semites to be eradicated. So what we have here is little islands of difference, little islands of independence, little islands experimenting learning systems counter to the mainstream, under the influence of specific mentorships going from generation to generation, and somehow or other that chain that I described to you sort of infects Adina Cimet, and Adina Cimet influences Rachmiel Peltz, and you are now in partnership with Lublin. Things are not by chance. They're connected. It's influences. Little influences can make big differences. Vladislav Bartoszewski was a very, very young man on the Aryan side of the Warsaw Ghetto. Young people change the world. Such as this case, we're going to have an exhibit at Drexel starting in January at the Haggerty Library, put together by a professor of African American Studies on children in the Civil Rights Movement. I was a child in the Civil Rights Movement at age 14. As basically a child, I was on the picket line, the core picket lines of the Woolworth lunch counters, if you ever know the history of that Civil Rights Movement. It was young people. It wasn't just children happened to be there. Young people can make changes. People college age, really, in this system after the war, they took over. It was teenagers who saved anything that was saved. Sometimes these teenagers were derelicts, were people who were out of the system, who were juvenile delinquents. But they were able to save people in a ghetto, and then they became leaders of political organizations. So in this whole scheme, your age group isn't insignificant. And I just wanted to say that.
Definitely in the culture section on the war, that's the emphasis on how we read that period, and certainly for today. So we have hopes in all of it.
Any more questions or comments on your website projects? What you found?
I have a question about a comment you made last night. You talked about how you're pessimistic about the future of Yiddish language. And does that pessimism stem to other, not so endangered languages, but languages of the same status? Or do you really think it's just Yiddish language that you're pessimistic about because of the history behind it?
I'm going to say now something that I couldn't say yesterday, okay? Since you are asking me, and we are in petit comité right now, and I'm not trying to insult anyone on that. It's just my own feeling. I'm not a linguist, and therefore, I get less satisfaction from somebody telling me, you know what, I found a language, and it's such and such a name, and there are so many speakers, and I have recorded 300 of their words. It's wonderful. I mean, I'm not wrong here, but I hope. But yes, it's wonderful to record something. It's wonderful. It's medicinal values, for instance, of the words or whatever it is that we could record. Or I understand that kind of argument is useful to justify the strength of what the language represents. That each language represents a world, whether it is in the outskirts of an island or a volcano or a city or wherever it is, the language has absorbed, has eaten up in its concepts and its words everything that is going on physically in that world. So when we lose that, we lose the world. So that argument is very powerful. It's very, very important. But having said that, I think that recording that and having that in books or whatever medium we use is almost like creating a zoo, the equivalent of a zoo. We have the representative of this animal and that animal and the next one and the third one. That is not the life environment or the living environment. And I didn't want to use that metaphor yesterday because it made me feel that I don't appreciate the enormous amount of work and importance of the work of what Harrison is doing. But for me, it's not enough. At least it's not enough for a type of language like the one I'm living with, which is Yiddish, where I grew up with it, I know it, I understand it, I feel it in my bones. For instance, imagine my own experience. I got married to an Anglo person, right? To a person speaking English. I moved from wherever I was as a child, and when time came that I was raising my children, I had to make a choice. What language am I going to speak? Will I speak the language of the country I came with, I was educated in? Will I speak English, which is the language that I'm using and they need to know? Or do I speak Yiddish, which is the home language that I had, and which my husband wasn't actually so proficient in? What do I do? You know, I can't say sweetie pie and pumpkin this and I don't know what, all these expressions in English sounding good. To me, they sound like I just learned them from a book. You know, they don't come from my liver, as we talked about this. You know, so, you know, I can't do it. I can't do it. And Spanish, to me, as dear as it is, and as close as it is, because I grew up with it from day one, is a language that doesn't depend on me at all, you know? And if I didn't choose Yiddish to be the language of my home, who would? Who would do it? And Yiddish speaks to my heart because my grandmother was speaking it and knew it, and she would be able to communicate with it with my children, which were her great-grandchildren, in a way that if I taught them any other language, she wouldn't. So I would cut off even that chain if I was going to make a decision like that, you know, which was different, and so on and so forth. So to me, the sensation that when I speak about this language, my language, I'm not speaking only of knowing that I have the literature safe in computers, people are translating it. That's not enough for me. I had a world and a tool and a way of thinking and expressing and living and feeling emotions from any minute that I'm up till when I dream, that if I don't have a context anymore, they're gone to me as a person. And I feel that so deeply that it's not enough. I don't get satisfaction from recording enough or translating, as important as that is for communication about the culture. I need the culture to live, you know, as best as it can live today, and that is another kind of revitalization that he talked about, but it's not enough to create songs. I have done, actually, ridiculous as it may sound, songs for my grandchildren, you know, and I don't have the best of voices or anything like that, just because in the environment of the home you do as much, or I did as much as I could to help towards that. But, you know, I don't think that that's going to do it, and that hasn't done it. I have worked with people that have learned the language. Rafmiel, for instance, is about to create a program with the Yivo Institute to create and prepare teachers for it, and he has trouble finding the teachers for it, the sufficiently sophisticated, well-knowledgeable people in many fields. You know, that is becoming the worst of our problems.
Do you think that, we spoke about this in, I don't think it was class, in a different class with Dr. Peltz, and how Jews are now learning things that they used to learn in the home in school. Do you think that has a relationship to Yiddish being lost? How Jews aren't feeling as connected to their culture and like don't know all of the other traditions?
Jews have, for the most part, secular Jews for the most part, I'm not talking about particular people that may be exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, Yiddish is not in the horizon anymore. Yiddish was finished. Yiddish, to some, it sounds, my nostalgic grandma, my booby, but the words are even distorted, you know, with the American sounding words or whatever. She used to say this word, and she used to make this food that was lovely, and those cookies that were for a specific holiday, and I don't know what. And that's it. They don't know about it. They don't understand what it means to lose a language. They, in fact, tell you, well, why do we need it? You know, you speak English so nicely. Or, you know, get rid of your accent. You still speak with your accent. What's the matter with you? You know, get more proficient. Or, you know, what's the problem? You still have to argue like that in the world. Why is a language important? It's not a self-understood topic at all. And in the Jewish world, there is a confluence, another problem, which is that Israel has the national language is Hebrew. And in Israel, it's only in 1992, if I'm not mistaken, that Yiddish was recognized as the second language of the people, of the culture. You know, it's late. It's very late. And even then, I don't know how much budget it's going to do something about it, or with it, with that recognition. In a Jewish school here, in a day school, if you go, you have to argue that case. They don't see the need for it because they understand the education, and we don't have an institute that regulates educational philosophy for a minority. Every school has their own think tank, and they understand education as either elements of religion and tradition, Hebrew, of course, which I absolutely agree upon, and that's it. You know, and the fact that we have two nostrils to breathe with is not the fact that they think of. One doesn't negate the other. We have a very, very important language and culture. I mean, before the war, there is an argument between 70 to 80-something% of Jewry was Ashkenazi, and spoke it, and knew it, and understood it, and used it more or less depending on the regions. That has changed dramatically. Those demographics do not exist anymore, and therefore every group fights for equality of that, which is fine and respect, but we have a salad today.
Yeah, just a similar comment to that. I went to a Jewish day school from ages like 3 to 7, and I always lived with my grandmother, and she said, "What are you learning?" And when I was at that age, we were learning to speak in French and Spanish and Hebrew, and she's like, "But what about Yiddish?" And they were like, "Oh, it's unimportant. It's much more important to educate them in French and Spanish rather than Hebrew." And she was like, "How do you reconcile that with everything else?" And they're like, "Well, we're preparing them for the world." She was like, "How about preparing them to that I want to actually continue to live with my granddaughter rather than prepare her for the world at age 4. She's like, "What use is counting to 10 when I can't talk to you?"
Right. Well, that's it. We have very many different philosophies. People here had the immigrant community and other American people wanted very much to blend in quickly, to function well, the children to study, to achieve, to get jobs, all good things. I'm not denying any of that, but at a very high price. Very, very high price. Very derogatory of the way we spoke, of the way we lived, or devaluing. And maybe the war contributed to it, not just physically killing, but making it sound that it wasn't so good to be different there.
I want to thank Dr. Cimet for coming from New York to teach us yesterday and today, to teach us here in Philadelphia, and to teach our partners in Berlin.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we're going to continue our conversation.